Professor at the University of Oxford, Julian Savulescu. Professor, welcome. From your personal perspective, how far behind the technological development are the ethical questions concerning biotechnology?
Probably about 50 years. I think
50 years.
Yeah, we really need an
Could I ask you to
revolution.
put the mic a little bit closer, please?
Yeah, we need an ethical revolution, I think.
We need ethical revolution.
Scientific revolution, yeah.
Okay. Could you walk us through to the big ethical questions, please?
Well, the biggest ethical question is, are we going to fundamentally change ourselves as an animal? And I'm going to argue now that we should do that. But before I do, I want to start following on from Raymond's fantastic talk, with a personal anecdote. So in November last year, my mother died of Alzheimer's disease at the age of 86. And it's a terrible disease. I'm sure many of you have had experience with it. It's essentially the disintegration of a human being. And you often hear in Europe about human dignity. I mean, Alzheimer's disease is something that takes away human dignity. And I'm a great believer in technology, so a number of years ago I had my own genome, or parts of it, done with 23andMe, partly to see what my risk of Alzheimer's disease was. And you can pay, I think, $100 and have your ApoE4 tested. So if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you're almost certain to get Alzheimer's disease, and a small percentage of you will have that. If you've got 1 copy, you're at double the background risk. So roughly you're at 20% risk, whereas a person without any copies of E4 is at about 10% risk. And luckily or unluckily, I have 1 copy. So my background risk is double the ordinary population. 15% of you will have 1 copy of E4. So let me ask you, just to start with, if there was a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting cancer from taking a medication, but that medication would reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease from 20% to 10%, who would want to take the medication? I would. Hands up high? I think roughly half of you would. And sadly, there isn't such a medication, but as Raymond said, we're reaching the point where, for the next generation, we can change that E4. He mentioned a knockout of a gene that would confer resistance to Alzheimer's disease is another way. And really, the issue is just the risks and the benefits. When the risks reduce to a certain level, it's rational, and people will vote with their feet to reduce those risks. And we're reaching that point where we can change the next generation so that they don't have a 20% risk of Alzheimer's disease, or they don't have a 10% risk, maybe they don't have any risk. And we have a moral obligation to do that, because that is such a bad disease. So my main points are going to be today that research into diseases like Alzheimer's disease using gene editing or cloning is an absolute moral imperative. Because the way, as Raymond said, to do this is not to fiddle around with drugs. It's to change that one cell that causes the trillions of cells that make up our body. That reproductive, or using this technology to create new human beings, is at present unsafe, but it will be safe. And we need what's called a translational pathway. And I'm going to give you a new idea today. I'm going to provide that translational pathway to you. Not only could we treat diseases like Alzheimer's disease, but we could enhance human beings. And I'm going to argue that that can be done ethically. And rather than calling for more moratoria or new laws, we have laws preventing gene editing and cloning. We actually need good ethics to decide how to gene edit and clone in an ethical way. So Raymond's already covered the CRISPR-Cas9 system. In 2015, it was first used as a research tool on human embryos. And even this use as a research tool met with outrage, and many scientists called for a ban on any kind of research into the human, into modifying the human genome, even for research purposes. They raised a number of concerns, which I don't have time to go through individually. But what's important is that this kind of research can be done not just to create human beings that are resistant to Alzheimer's disease, but to develop new drugs, new understandings of the origin of Alzheimer's disease or other diseases, and to develop new therapies. And so we can draw a clear distinction, as we've done in the cloning debate, between research to develop understanding, new interventions, new drugs, versus creating live-born human beings that have either been cloned or genetically modified. And this is cheap, it's globally accessible because you can produce drugs, it doesn't harm women, and it's not a risk to future generations. So if you're concerned about the sorts of issues that were raised in 2015, you can stick to research. There is no reason to ban this sort of research. So that's the first issue. But of course, the most controversial area is not producing a new drug using embryonic research, but using this technology to create live-born human beings, to treat medical conditions, to make humans resistant to infection, to delay aging, or to enhance human beings. So in November last year, Jiankui released a video in which he described having genetically modified 2 human embryos, Lulu and Nana. And this is what I said in a press release at the time. I described it as a monstrous experiment. And my reason for doing that was that he took 2 normal human embryos that had no known risk of disease and attempted to delete the CCR5 gene, as Raymond said. Now, these particular children had stood to benefit in no way from this directly, because there are a number of ways of preventing HIV. You can not have blood transfusions from people with HIV, not have sex with individuals with HIV, and so on. So what he did was expose these embryos to a risk of malformation or cancer in the future for no direct benefit to them. And for that reason, I said it was monstrous. But I'm going to describe a way in which this experiment could be done. But before I do that, I want to give a bit of a broader context around what happened. Jiankui didn't produce an academic publication describing this experiment. And in fact, there was another pregnancy underway, which presumably now has resulted in a live birth. He was outed by the MIT Tech Review. So he wasn't going to release this data at the time. I think he was waiting to see whether his research was successful. And indeed, the reaction by China was really one where he brought shame on Chinese research. But if it had been a success, he would have brought glory. Now, Raymond also mentioned the biohacking movement. A month before this story broke, one of my friends, a biohacker, said to me, I'm thinking about going to China to produce embryos and genetically modify them, gene edit them. And I said, are you sure? Are you sure that you can do that? And she said, yes, there's people in China who'll do it. And, you know, it costs, I think I was quoted something around the $100,000 mark. And after this story broke, I asked her, was it Jiankui that was involved in your potential gene editing? She said, no, it wasn't. So it's quite possible that this isn't the only way in which this is occurring in China. And as I'm going to argue, I don't think this is about providing treatments for disease. I think it's about human enhancement, because this was actually a gene edit not to treat a disease, it was to enhance a human being and give them a capacity that they didn't have previously. Now, why do I say it's monstrous, even though I'm a supporter of human genetic enhancement? The reason is it repeated a mistake that I wrote about 20 years ago, and that was the mistake that resulted in the death of Jesse Gelsinger. And Jiankui was aware of this. He actually wrote an ethics article that is a fantastic example of ethics light, where he mentions Gelsinger, but failed to learn the lesson of Gelsinger's death. So Gelsinger was an 18-year-old man who was enrolled in a trial, one of the first gene therapy trials, at a very prestigious institution in the University of Pennsylvania. And he had what's called OTC deficiency. This is a deficiency in metabolising nitrogen. But he was able to control this. He had a very mild version of the disease with just diet alone. So he was injected with adenovirus particles and died 4 days later. Now, at the time the trial was set up, there was a question of whether to use adult participants like Gelsinger or severely affected newborns. The condition comes in two versions: the mild version, which can be controlled by diet, and a severe version, which results in death in the first year of life. And the justification for taking adults was, well, they can consent. They can agree to take part, whereas a newborn can't. But I think that was a mistake, and I wrote so 20 years ago, because Gelsinger had a whole 70 or 60 years of life left to lose. A newborn would have had months of life potentially left to lose if it had died as a result of the experiment. So put simply, Gelsinger was exposed to a greater expected harm at the start of the trial. And in fact, Gelsinger's father realised that. He said it was a mistake to use adult participants rather than severely affected newborns. And the reason for that was people gave greater weight to consent than to preventing harm. But we should minimise expected harm by choosing participants who have the shortest life expectancy, the lowest probability of survival, or the poorest quality of life. So what that means is, when you're going to start a therapy which has a risk of causing cancer or death or severe malformation, don't start it in people with normal life expectancy. And that's exactly what Jiankui did. He took normal embryos and exposed them to a risk. Instead, he could have used embryos which were destined to die. There are a number of genetic abnormalities such as BRAT1, or maybe some of you have heard of Tay-Sachs disease that affects the Jewish community. Results in death very early in life. If you did this experiment on an embryo with Tay-Sachs disease, you wouldn't have exposed them to significant expected harm. In fact, you could have saved their lives. So at the time of Jiankui's announcement, many people, including George Daly, the Dean of Harvard Medical School, called for a translational pathway. And he said that we should look at diseases like Tay-Sachs disease or Huntington's disease as first candidates for first-in-human trials. But this shows, again, that the lack of understanding of ethics, because Huntington's disease is a disease that comes on at the age of 40 or 50. You have 40 or 50 normal years. An embryo, a person with Huntington's disease, stands to lose 40 or 50 years if they're killed as a result of a gene editing experiment. So in fact, it's Tay-Sachs disease, not Huntington's disease. So here you go. Here is a novel idea. Everyone's been talking about a need for a translational pathway. Here is one. Start with terminal conditions like BRAT1 or Tay-Sachs or disorders that will kill individuals in embryonic development or in the first year of life. Then move on to conditions that cause severe brain abnormalities like Lesch-Nyhan disease. And after it's successful in those, move in to disorders that affect rational agency and autonomy like Fragile X and Down syndrome. And after that, move into disorders like Huntington's disease. And once it's been shown to be effective for diseases, then we can look at enhancing human beings. For example, preventing HIV infection. If there were a vaccination for HIV that was safe, we would all have it. The problem is that gene editing at the moment is unsafe and risky, and there are other ways of avoiding HIV. But at some point, when the technology matures, we will be engineering HIV resistance into embryos. And after that, we'll be enhancing normal human characteristics. There's a new condition called low normal IQ, an IQ that's normal, but in the the second standard deviation below the mean, between 70 and 85. Individuals with this level of IQ unable to complete a tax return in the US, unable to participate in a technologically advanced society. And while this is normal and not classified as disease, that's purely for statistical reasons, because we define disease as 2 standard deviations, not 1 standard deviation below the normal. But in the future, just as we look at intellectual disability as a target for medical therapy and gene editing, so too will be those variants of normal that reduce people's life chances and reduce their rational agency, reduce their autonomy, and reduce their well-being. So one of the objections to using gene editing that Francis Collins and other very significant, Francis Collins is the head of the NIH, have given against gene editing is that we don't need it, because as Raymond said, we have genetic selection using embryos. And as he pointed out already, we're looking at embryos. He mentioned genomic potential. We're looking at embryos for polygenic risk scores for intelligence. People are trying to select against low normal intelligent embryos in favour of embryos with a better chance of a better life. And I've argued that we have a moral obligation to do that. And many people actually implicitly agree with me. When there was the Zika epidemic, Public Health England recommended to people to wait 3 months before they attempted to have a child. But by waiting 3 months, they would have a different embryo with a better chance of not having intellectual disability. So what Public Health England was saying was, select the embryo with a better chance of a better life. And that's when this technology is affordable, that's what people will be doing. So Collins has said we don't need to gene therapy, we don't need to gene edit out cystic fibrosis because we can select out embryos. It's already here. But of course, that's not going to work for common conditions where there are 40, 50, 100, 200 genes. Intelligence has thousands of genes contributing to it. So dealing with common conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on are not going to be amenable to selection of 10 or 20 embryos. You're going to have to change hundreds of genes. And in the future, that's what gene editing will be used for. Now, designer babies is the area where we have the greatest fear. I want to argue now that this is not something we should fear, but we should embrace. As Raymond said, gene editing is a step improvement in what's been going on for 20 or 30 years in genetic engineering. So even prior to gene editing, we've been able to engineer super mice that run 6 kilometres rather than 200 metres. We've been able to engineer mice that live twice as long, Methuselah mice. And there's no reason biologically why you couldn't do this to a human being. A human being, biologically, is not very different from a dog or a mouse. Mice with better memory, monkeys that work harder, voles that are monogamous. This shows you the power of genetic engineering. And it's for this reason that China is investing so much and leading the world. So indeed, China has an extremely vigorous program, or at least did until recently, into looking at the genetic contribution to intelligence. The Beijing Genetics Institute had, at the time, the largest genome sequencing facility of any research institution in the world. And Robert Plomin, the world's leading behavioural geneticist for investigating intelligence, collaborated with BGI to identify a number of genes associated with intelligence. And as we've already heard, this knowledge of genes is being used to select embryos using polygenic risk scores, but it's also obviously a target for gene editing. And in my view, this will be irresistible. The US military has said there's 4.2 billion people over the age of 20. Even a small enhancement of cognitive capacity in these individuals will have an effect on world economy similar to that of the internet. If you increase the IQ of the whole population by 3 points, that's 3%, you'd reduce poverty by about 25%, welfare recipiency by 20%, you'd add 1.5% to GDP, 150 billion to the US economy, at least based on evidence from lead abatement studies. So even a small increase is going to have massive social benefits. That's why China is investing in this technology, not to prevent HIV. CCR5, just a very easy gene to knock out. It will also result, or possibly it affects brain development. Knocking CCR5 out will also possibly result in higher intelligence. Increased susceptibility to the flu and West Nile virus. So any genetic modification has pluses and minuses. But sometimes the pluses clearly outweigh the minuses, as half of you said when it came to reducing your own risk. So what should be the ethical principles that govern this kind of revolution? Well, as soon as I talk about gene editing or genetic selection, people always say, isn't this eugenics? Isn't this what the Nazis did? Creating a supreme race. What the Nazis did was involuntarily sterilise people who were intellectually disabled, criminals who had psychiatric diseases, or killed them, the famous T4 program. It was involuntary. It wasn't aimed for the benefit of the people involved, to enable them to have better lives, and it was to bring about a social Darwinist, racist view of society. That's what was wrong with Nazi eugenics. But if we use our knowledge of genes and gene editing to enable people to have better lives, that enable them or their parents to make voluntary choices, we're not practicing Nazi eugenics. Sterilisation, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, prenatal testing, non-invasive prenatal testing, all of these can be used for eugenic purposes, but they can also be used to enable reproductive freedom and enable people to have better lives. So any technology, any powerful technology can be abused, but it can also be used for great good. And for that reason, we need ethics. So what is ethics? Ethics is about reasons. Reasons are like vectors in physics. They have a direction and a strength. To work out what you should do, whether you should use gene editing to modify a normal embryo or modify an embryo with a genetic disorder or a severe genetic disorder or a brain disorder, you need to understand what the balance of reasons is. And this is a kind of reasoning we engage with every day when we decide whether to buy a car or take a medication ourselves or modify a human being. So what are the reasons that are important? Well-being. The most important reason that was not a part of Nazi eugenics at all was the well-being of people. And what is well-being? 2,000 years of philosophy, there are three main theories: happiness, desire fulfillment, or objective goods. Having deep social relationships, being creative, being autonomous, being able to gain knowledge of the world. So if we're making genetic modifications that are promoting all of these, as surely treating brain disorders does, we're promoting the well-being of people. The second major vector is freedom. And when it comes to adults, we should allow them to make their choices about whether you take the drug to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease with a 1 in 1,000 chance. And in the case of embryos, we ought to leave it to the parents. The third major reason is justice. One of the great fears with the genetic revolution is that it will create a two-tiered society, the genetically superior and the genetically inferior. We already have a multi-layered society. Nobody is born equal. Some people are born extremely privileged and lucky. Some people are born genetically with a short straw. Actually, gene editing and technology enables us to achieve justice and equality if we provide it to the worst off. So really, the main issue around gene editing and genetic technology is who will have access to it. And of course, if it's expensive, if it's $500,000 for one treatment, only the rich will have access. But if everyone has access to it, it can reduce inequality. There are many other vectors, but let me finish with just a thought experiment. Imagine that you have a child who is born with an extreme gift, an IQ of 160. And if you do nothing, the child's IQ will just drop to average, to 100. But by giving a small pill, a vitamin replacement, the child's IQ will be preserved. Should you give the pill? Of course you should, because you're protecting something valuable. And now let's assume that a child's born with an absolutely average IQ of 100, and you can give the same pill to result in a stunning IQ. And the pill's completely safe, it's cheap, there's no side effects. Should you give the pill? Should you give the vitamin? Of course you should. Because if IQ is worth protecting, it's worth enhancing. The only difference between a vitamin and gene editing are the risks. And at some point the risks will be low enough to make it worth taking. So the reason why cloning hasn't taken off is because there aren't any clear benefits. If you've got one embryo and you're 45 and you're not going to have another child, maybe you should clone that embryo in case there's a miscarriage. Or maybe if you've got leukemia and cloning were efficient, you should clone a saviour sibling and take some cord blood. But apart from those applications, cloning, there hasn't been a great need and it hasn't been efficient. But if it were necessary to preserve the species, we would use it. China is already cloning police dogs, 10,000 from a single clone. It's widely used in animal husbandry. So the real issue is not whether we use gene editing and cloning to modify life, it's what ethical principles should we use to govern it. People will vote with their feet. Once a technology is mature and the benefits outweigh the risks, people will use it. And the challenge is not to have another moratorium around gene editing, as Francis Collins and others called for. The challenge is how to work out how to do it ethically. Today I've provided you with a translational pathway. I've sketched just 3 ethical principles. There are more. But the challenge is to develop a new ethics so we can use this technology to promote humanity and promote human dignity and not to undermine it. Thank you.
Professor, do you believe that there is a chance that we, as a humankind, will have global rules concerning the ethics and the technology of human gene editing?
The only hope that we won't have a world government or an enforceable set of global rules. The only hope we have is to come together on a set of ethical principles that we all believe in. And frankly, you know, we've passed by the imperialism of Europe and the US in terms of their ethical principles. The Chinese just don't see the sense in saying we should never modify human life. And I think they're right. And I think the challenge is to come up with a set of principles that the Chinese can sign up to and that we can also sign up to. And we're still living in a Judeo-Christian world where many people just even object to contraception and sterilisation and IVF and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So pre-implantation genetic diagnosis illegal in Germany, despite the fact that abortion is available on demand. That's just a crazy situation. So I think we need to upscale our ethics and find a globally acceptable ethic.
And do you see any principles that would be acceptable for the Czech Republic, US and China?
Yeah, I mean, everyone cares about their well-being and the well-being of their children. So the first issue should be the well-being of people affected by a decision. China perhaps cares less about autonomy and freedom than we do, so they will give less weight. There is a concern that everyone have a fair go. What exactly that means differs from the US to China. But that's where I think the money is, to try to understand what principles like justice, like what constitutes human well-being, how much weight to give to freedom. China has 1 billion, or more than 1 billion people. The amount of freedom they can give people is vastly different to the US, which is a rich country with a much greater GDP per capita. And so I think there are universal principles, but they will be instantiated in countries in different ways.
Ladies and gentlemen, Julian Savulescu. Thank you very much, Professor.